Alrighty, as everyone is being admitted, welcome. Welcome everybody to IFMA Toronto and South Central Ontario's web series. This is now our third, so thank you for tuning in again. My name is Sarah Claire. I am the Vice President of Programming and Education, and by day, I work proudly for Infrastructure Ontario. I'm your virtual moderator. We welcome all of our members and non-members, or as I like to say, future members. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be posted to the IFMA YouTube channel afterwards. Thank you to the IFMA team for making this presentation possible, especially to Lisa Martel, our chapter administrator, Kay Pays, our Vice President of Communications and Membership, Lisa Gushu, our Director of Programming, and Brennan Fico, our Director of Membership. As companies are making very tough decisions on what reentry is going to look like, we are so excited to partner with Pynchon today for our presentation. Today's topic is with regards to risk assessment and indoor environmental management. Are they the right tools for reoccupancy planning? Today's presenters will focus on the integration of risk assessment, management solutions, and a communication plan as a framework to enable organizations to take all reasonable precautions and demonstrate due diligence. Today's presentation is approximately 45 minutes long, leaving room for active discussion afterwards. We will open up the Q&A to all of you where you can type into the chat function into your screen. Before I conduct our speaker introductions, I'd like to pause for a safety moment. Everyone plays a part in stopping the spread of COVID-19. In the City of Toronto, starting July 7th, 2020, wearing a mask or face covering is required in all indoor public spaces beginning under the City of Toronto bylaws, extending into many other municipalities since. The mask or face covering should cover your nose, mouth, and chin without gaps. Wearing a mask or face covering is an additional measure we can all take to reduce the spread of COVID-19 and keep each other safe. This means that with some exceptions, all staff, vendors, and any other members of the public entering into indoor premises are required to wear a mask at face covering while inside. As we learn more about the virus and as research develops, so do these guidelines. With that, I will introduce our esteemed speakers. Starting with Mark Beasy. Mark is a senior risk assessor with Pynchon and has worked with environmental risk assessment for 13 years. His primary expertise is with environmental and human health toxicology and contaminant chemistry. Mark will discuss risk assessment and risk management associated with COVID-19 as it relates to building reoccupancy and with the resumption of workplace activities. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thanks, and I'm just going to finish our introductions and then I'll hand it right over to you. Thank you. Stephen Booth is our Director of the GTA Indoor Environmental Quality and Occupational Health and Safety Groups at Pynchon. Stephen has had more than 20 years of hazardous building materials and indoor air quality consulting experience and a diploma in architectural technology. Stephen has developed standards for mold assessment and remediation and indoor quality in Ontario through his work with the Environmental Abatement Council of Ontario. Welcome, Stephen. And Trevor. Trevor Howling is an operations manager, is a regional practice lead in the Building Science and Sustainability Group. He provides a diverse expertise in all areas relating to building sciences, hazardous materials, indoor air quality, microbial contamination, and environmental assessments. He is a professional engineer with mechanical and environmental backgrounds and serves as operations manager and regional practice lead for all Atlantic offices for the Hazardous Building Materials Group and the Building Sciences Group. Welcome, Trevor. Well, that was quite the tongue twister for me, as you noticed. But with that, I would like to hand it over to Mark. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. I was a little premature in unmuting. As Sarah said, I am a senior risk assessor with Pynchon. My primary expertise are in human health toxicology and contaminant chemistry. My clients include property owners that are looking to either redevelop their property or perhaps to manage any contamination they may have in their soil, groundwater, or indoor air. So I'm going to start my portion of the talk with a brief introduction to risk assessment in general and how it applies to strategies for building reoccupancy as a result of the loosening of restrictions and what we hope is the waning of the pandemic. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the pandemic itself. But since we're all familiar with the concept of flattening the curve and how physical distancing is the key factor in preventing viral transmission. So to that end, we will talk about the tools that Pynchon has put together that will help facilitate the risk management measures until a more normal workplace environment can resume in our buildings. Brennan? Okay, so how do we know when it's safe to resume our activities? Well, we all know we're in a very unique environment right now. And because this is a novel virus, our understanding of it and the science involved in that is perpetually evolving. Effectively, we are learning new things every day. But one thing we do know is that the risk associated with the transmission of the virus will never be zero. So to that end, how do we take all reasonable precautions while still running our businesses? And how do we demonstrate due diligence for all stakeholders, such as staff, visitors, or other members of the public? So I'll talk a little bit about risk assessment in general. At its basis, it's something we inherently do every day in our everyday lives, whether it's in physical activities such as sports, where we make the decision as to whether to go for the big play or instead make the safe pass. We do a risk-based decision to how we cross the street. Do we take a higher risk but a higher benefit to jaywalking perhaps, or do we go and make the safe walk at the intersection, the crosswalk? And then of course, there's also financial risk assessment, where we inherently know what our risk tolerance is. And that helps dictate whether we take a high risk reward investment or whether we put our money into a safer product such as a savings account. Now, Pynchon believes that risk assessment is a valuable tool for dealing with COVID-19 and the reopening of our businesses and workplaces. In fact, Pynchon believes it is the correct tool. As shown in this Venn diagram, risk assessment helps inform the management solutions that we may need to implement based on our understanding of the risk factors. It also informs and helps us determine how we define and communicate and manage those risks. And so risk assessment therefore becomes a tool for documenting this entire process. So the framework that we've been using for this process is universally used by regulatory agencies worldwide. It's not unique in itself. In fact, the initiation for how we have been putting together our risk assessments for building reoccupancies is based on Health Canada's own public health risk-based processes for closing workplaces due to the pandemic back in March and April. It's a qualitative process that helps us identify the risks on a low to medium to high risk basis for the building environment and the workplace activities that we undertake. And it also helps us decide how we reopen and what precautions we need to take. So why is it the right tool for reoccupancy? Well, a number of reasons. One, it helps us identify all the risk factors that may be associated with our workplace activities. And it helps us make sure that we don't miss anything. So essentially, we can document our entire decision-making process that allows it to be defensible when put under scrutiny. It helps us prioritize the management measures that we may need to put into place to mitigate the risks based on the high, medium, and low risks that we have identified. And by having this defensible framework, it can help us alleviate the concerns that stakeholders may have. And finally, it helps us balance the costs and benefits associated with the measures that we put in place, so that we don't put in redundancies or measures that may not be necessary. So the process itself is based on building reconnaissance that can be in the form of a questionnaire and a visit to the site to meet with the property manager or site owner. And once we get that information, where we identify any hazards and risks that may lead to anticipated unacceptable risks, as shown in this flow chart, we can then weight the risks, and that helps us prioritize the risk mitigation measures that we may need to implement in order to reoccupy our buildings and workplaces. So the risks themselves are associated with the transmission of the virus. We're not going to get into the severity of the disease should we actually be infected by the virus, but rather the transmission from an infected person to a previously uninfected person. The highest risk of transfer is through droplet and direct contact. This is in the form of sneezing or coughing or talking to someone in close proximity. That is where an infected droplet travels a short distance and can be effectively received by a person on their mouth, their nose, or their eyes. Medium risk is in the form of indirect contacts on surfaces such as doorknobs, shared washrooms, printers, or other shared workstations. Sources of low risk for transfer are those from airborne. Those are smaller droplets that may be otherwise evaporated, that travel greater distances over greater time, as well as the unfortunately named fecal-oral pathway, which in the early stages of the pandemic was, there were concerns related to transfer of the virus through droplets that come via shared washrooms. However, it has been established that there is little evidence of transmission through airborne or fecal-oral pathways. So some of the factors that are often identified for workplace or building reoccupancy are these that are listed here. My colleague Stephen is going to go into these in a little more detail, but they include things such as the health of the underlying health of the occupants, the building layouts, the building use, the HVAC systems, etc. And once we have those factors and we establish some of the measures we can put into place, we can thereby set our priorities. What this diagram depicts is a filter, or effectively a sieve, where we start with what is initially a complex problem with multiple combinations of the occupants and the workplace activities. And once we put it through this filter, we can come up and establish the most practical measures that can help mitigate the potential for transfer of the virus. Now, here's an example of a portion of a risk matrix that we have produced for another client in a similar building with a commercial building. And this is for one specific characteristic activity, such as the washrooms in the workplace. It was established that the level of risk was low to medium, and based on that and the rationale that we'd established for this risk ranking, we had provided recommendations for risk management to help minimize the potential for viral transmission. So my final slide is just a brief depiction of the hierarchy of the management controls. I put this up to stress that physical distancing, maintaining that 2-meter distance between people, is the most effective means of limiting potential for transfer. It effectively removes the hazard itself. However, again, Stephen will speak about this in greater detail presently. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. I'm Steve Booth, the director for the Indoor Environmental Quality and OH&S groups in the Mississauga office. And if we might as well move to the next slide, and we'll, what I want to talk about sort of first off is sort of communication and this idea that sometimes the hazard, so the thing that we think of as the critical risk, is sometimes less important than the concern wrapped around that specific risk. So you may have something that's not particularly hazardous, but generates a great deal of concern. And to some degree, this coronavirus, it falls into that category. So there's certainly risk, but people are also worried and concerned about it. So how do we address that and bring that in line? And that's really, we have to have a really good quality communication plan that lets people know that as building operators, we understand the properties, we have a plan, we're implementing the plan, and perhaps some tests in place to make sure that that plan is actually working on an ongoing basis. So that's key to the communication side of things. So what I want to, in the next couple of slides, I want to look at two separate areas: commercial office, and the next slide, retail space. And you know, the way we work and the way we operate in buildings needs to change really fundamentally around this. All the things that we took for granted in an office before all have an element of risk now, because for years we'd brought more and more people into offices and packed them into denser and denser workspaces, you know, and now that's exactly the opposite of what we need to have happen to minimize the risks around spreading COVID-19. So, you know, it really is a step of, you know, what you have to look at every action that people are taking when they're coming into the building and evaluating that risk. So one of the obvious things right off the bat is elevators, and that is an obvious challenge because there's no way in most elevators to maintain that physical distance. They're not particularly well ventilated, and you know, so we have to build controls around that to minimize the risk to the extent that we can. You know, the next thing you might do in the office is come into the reception area. So there's what has been traditionally a very close contact interaction with the person at the reception desk. So you might lean over the desk and have a chat with them, drop off parcels, sign in, hold the pen. So there's all kinds of different things that we have to think about now in that setting, and how do we control and minimize the chance that we're going to spread this coronavirus through those activities. You know, and then we can look deeper in the hoteling stations that we have at the office. How do we maintain them clean? Washrooms, those deliveries we are, and meetings. So one of the best things about offices is that we got together and we collaborated and shared our thoughts and had vigorous discussions, and really now that's off the table. So we have to understand how we do accomplish that same goal without that physical closeness that presents that fundamental risk. You know, similar ideas apply on the retail side of the spectrum. So it's a, you know, it's a little bit of a different situation, but you know, store owners need to be looking at how many occupants are in their store at a time. You know, the previous goal was as many people in shopping at once. That'd be the best solution, but now we can't do that anymore. How do we lay out the store to minimize those physical interactions? How do we clean the things that people are touching on a regular basis? How are we handling payments? All these things, you know, need to be thought about through a completely different lens than we were thinking about them 3 or 4 months ago. So to go back to Mark's presentation for a second, you know, that first area is that let's eliminate the risk where we can. And you know, the best way to possibly eliminate the risk would be to make sure that anyone who was infected with the virus, you know, wasn't present in the workplace. So to that end, you know, a variety of screening measures are certainly important to try and reduce the number of sick people coming to work. So whether that's improving sick policies, so people don't have to come to work ill, to signs and notifications reminding people of the symptoms and suggesting they don't enter the building when they're sick, or whether it's self-screening and temperature measurements for individuals before they come in the building. All those steps are necessary. The fundamental problem with all of them is that a significant percentage of people who are infected and spreading the virus are completely asymptomatic. They don't have a fever, they don't have any symptoms. You're not going to catch them through that screening system. So, you know, while elimination is the goal, would be the goal, it's not something that we're necessarily going to be perfect at, although it's still worth trying. The other thing we can eliminate are activities that were risky before that we don't need to do anymore. So that in-person 10-person boardroom meeting, don't have that, have the meeting via this kind of a setup. If there's touch contacts on all the doors in the office, can we prop those doors open so people don't have to touch them anymore? If there's a coffee machine, can we remove the coffee machine and people will just go and get takeout coffee or something. So we have to be thinking about what kind of steps we can eliminate and where we can eliminate them. So the highest risk concern is around this direct contact. So we need to look at ways we can maintain that physical distancing in the office. And for the most part, that's going to result in significantly reduced occupancy in offices. So most of the clients that we're talking to are looking at numbers anywhere between 20 and 50%. Also, we can, where we can't enforce a separation by actual space, we can engineer a barrier. So we could put a plexiglass or polyethylene or some kind of temporary barrier between the people to create a separation where we can't maintain that 6-foot distance. And then, you know, currently in the news and becoming very common, at least in the GTE, are wearing masks or face coverings. So they essentially act as a barrier to stop the particulate that comes out of your respiratory system from getting any further than that face mask, thus reducing the risk and allowing people to be, you know, if they cross paths quickly in an aisle, at least we've got that level of control through the face mask. So I'm going to move to the next slide. So the next, you know, we have to address those medium risks, those indirect contact, and how do we do that? Well, the first and foremost way is by enforcing and making personal hygiene really easy for people. So having hand sanitizer at key locations throughout the building. You get off the escalator, there's hand sanitizer at the top because you held the handrail. You get out of the elevator and you press the buttons and held onto the rail or leaned against the wall. So there's hand sanitizer when you get off. So we promote that personal hygiene by providing the tools to make it as easy as possible for people to maintain that level of personal hygiene. And then cleaning protocols is the next step. The reality is it's never going to be possible for us to clean a building so frequently that between Mark going in and me going in, someone's wiped the buttons down. So if, you know, Mark had COVID-19 and I didn't, there's a risk there. We can clean regularly, but really it comes down to the personal hygiene side. And we need to, when we look at cleaning, we need to look at 2 different kinds of cleaning. Cleaning from an incident point of view, so someone has COVID-19, what do we do? And cleaning from a what do we do day to day in the building side. So looking at the final risk level, sort of airborne risk, you know, as Mark pointed out, you know, all of the evidence from public health points out that this is a very unlikely way to acquire COVID-19. Regardless, ASHRAE has provided some pretty practical and relatively easy to implement guidance that Trevor's going to get into later, but essentially it's all around increasing ventilation in the building and increasing the quality of filtration. So if you're doing those 2 things, that's helping you manage that airborne risk. And then we move on to the next slide. So, you know, part of the communication piece needs to be, and we've seen this recently from clients, and need to demonstrate that as a landlord for a building or as a building operator, you're actually, the measures that you're taking are having an effect. And things like CO2 measurements are a very, very good way of demonstrating that your ventilation goals are being met. So whether it's continuous monitoring or spot measurements of CO2, those kind of things can help. ATP monitoring, so surface wipes to make sure that surfaces are clean and are being cleaned regularly. And that can all be used to reinforce the communication to the building occupants that the control measures are in place. So with that, I'll pass it over to Trevor.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Sarah, for the detailed introduction. So I'm going to chat a little bit about ventilation systems, since they're a hot topic these days with COVID-19, and a component of a risk assessment. With the time I have, I'm going to highlight a couple key topics. The first one being balancing and drafts of ventilation systems, and the second one being filtration systems. Next slide, Bryn, sorry. So let's first start off with a quick overview of ventilation systems. Heating, ventilating, and air conditioning systems, commonly known as HVAC, exist in many different formats. This diagram depicts a typical HVAC system commonly found in commercial or institutional buildings. Fundamentally, it's a recirculating system with a portion of outside air added continually, whilst a similar portion is exhausted. For many systems, the amount of outside air rate can be varied, providing more or less fresh air. Both the fresh air and the return air for the occupied space is filtered before being reintroduced back into the occupied spaces, with the air moving around using fans. Heating and cooling are typically provided by finned coils using heated or chilled water. So the journey that a virally infected droplet would experience to arrive back in an occupied space would typically include extended ducted air pathways, multiple changes in direction and air velocity, multiple surface impacts, including air filters, fans, dampers, and grills. So there's a good likelihood that a particle would impact, entrain, and dry on a surface during that journey. Now, while published research on healthcare ventilation systems and scenarios suggest that the transmission of droplets containing viral material is theoretically possible in these situations, it's thought to be less likely in a well-designed and properly maintained typical HVAC system in a public setting. The American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers, or ASHRAE, is a known authority on ventilation systems, developing standards and guidelines used throughout North America. This organization has been on the forefront of providing assistance and information regarding ventilation systems and COVID-19. As noted by the quote taken from the ASHRAE Epidemic Task Force Chair, key elements of a strategy to limit the spread of the COVID-19 virus are to perform needed heating, ventilating, and HVAC system maintenance, including filter changes, and to run HVAC equipment prior to reoccupancy. So ASHRAE stresses the importance of maintaining the HVAC systems, but we have to remember that there are different parts of the system that all need to be working together to be effective, and there's no one silver bullet, as we'd call it. One of those parts of a well-maintained HVAC system is balanced flows. While most HVAC systems are designed and balanced at the commissioning stage to eliminate drafts, over time systems can go out of balance. This can be due to changes in the use of the occupied spaces or by reconfiguration of spaces. For example, putting up a wall to separate an office into two, and one of those has the supply air diffuser. Airflow that was calculated for the large space is now being dumped into a smaller space. Things can get worse when people start blocking off diffusers due to drafts, which results in pushing more air to other diffusers and extending the draft problem. We would recommend recommissioning or rebalancing those systems so that they're brought back to either the original design conditions or such that they meet the new conditions. This allows to remove drafts. In addition, recommissioning can also provide opportunities to ensure the system is running efficiently. If your systems can't be balanced, in other words, a fixed type of system, look at where drafts are and prevent people from occupying the direct pathway. Next slide. So why is airflow important and why are drafts a problem? HVAC systems are designed to minimize drafts, and there are various types of grills or diffusers that are made to accomplish this. Different grills have different applications. As the 6 grills shown here, each differ in their configuration and are used in different settings from industrial to commercial office. However, they all have one thing in common, and that's to reduce drafts. This is important as we've already discussed the possibility of airborne transmission of COVID due to suspension in droplets. With drafts, airborne contaminants or droplets can be carried a further distance, almost like riding a wave across a room. By reducing or eliminating the drafts, we can reduce the mechanism that would carry viral infected droplets further across a room or space and spreading. So here we have an example of how drafts or airflow plays a role in an outbreak in a restaurant in China this year. In this picture, we have a seating arrangement of the restaurant with an air conditioner on the right side and an exhaust on the left side. The infected person, A1, sat at a table and had dinner with 9 friends. Dinner took about 1 to 1.5 hours. During this meal, the asymptomatic carrier released low levels of the virus into the air from their breathing. Airflow from the restaurant's air conditioner and exhaust was from the right to the left. Approximately 50% of the people at the infected person's table became sick over the next 7 days. 75% of the people on the adjacent downward table B became infected. And even 2 of the 7 people on the upward table C were infected, which believed to happen by turbulent airflow. No one at tables E or F became infected, since they were out of the main airflow or draft from the air conditioner on the right to the exhaust fan on the left of the room. Next slide. So a bit on filters. Filters and the practical issues. ASHRAE has designed a rating system known as MERV, or the Minimum Efficiency Reporting Value, which is a scale from 1 to 16. The higher the MERV rating, the more effective your filter is at trapping dust particles and other contaminants. Most commercial ventilation systems are equipped with MERV 7 to 12, while hospital and general surgery areas use filters with a MERV rating of 13 to 16. MERV 13 filters and above use the same media as an N95 face mask, so would provide a comparable level of filtration, which includes airborne bacteria and virally infected droplets. We do know from ASHRAE studies that low efficiency filters with a MERV rating of less than 8 are very unlikely to make a difference in filtering out viral infected droplets. When looking at filters, frame size. If you're considering changing filter types, you need to make sure that the filter housing can accommodate this change. Changing from, say, a MERV 8 to a MERV 13, you may have an issue as the thickness of the filter typically increases. In the picture, we see 3 different filters of different thicknesses as the filtration level increases. Pressure drop has to be considered. When you increase the filtration, you also increase the resistance of the air to pass through the filter. It has to work harder to pass through denser filter material. Because of this, there'll be a pressure drop across the filter bank. Now, this pressure drop may be minimal, but in some cases it can reduce the airflow that you provide to the occupied spaces and will result in the fan working harder than intended, which can lead to multiple problems, including overworking of the system. And when changing filters, the filter should be considered to be contaminated and treated as such. Health and safety procedures should be in place, and personal protective equipment should be used when changing out filters. One other note I want to make regarding filter selection is that with desired increase in filtration, so a higher MERV rated filters, these are subject to the supply chain and may not be consistently available, if available at all, for your system. Plus, you have to consider the increase in cost. As the MERV rating goes up, so does the filter cost. Next slide. So filters with higher MERV ratings need to be changed more frequently, especially higher MERV rated ones that are thinner to accommodate thinner filter banks. Overloaded filters can further restrict airflow, causing reduced ventilation, inefficient operation, higher energy bills, or even damage to the HVAC system itself. As we can see on the top photo, the filter's been damaged by the airflow trying to get through. The airflow literally made its own hole through the filtration system, and now there is essentially no filtration system as the airflow is bypassing the filters. In the photo below this, the filter was slightly removed to reduce the pressure drop created by overloaded filters. The filters used were putting too much of a strain on the system, so one was partially removed to relieve this. Once there's an opening though, air will flow through the point of least resistance. So again, essentially no filtration. It's well known that filters decline in performance as they age, and they become less effective at performing their job. The graph shown was an ASHRAE study on a filter performance over time. And as we see, without really any surprise, the lines showing longer duration show lower efficiency. Now, the rate of this may differ from building to building, depending on a number of factors such as usage and flow. However, the point to be made here is that frequent changing of filters maintains a higher level of filtration performance. Portable air cleaners. I see we're missing a good picture there, but portable air cleaners, if used properly, they can help in reducing airborne contaminants, including viral infected droplets of COVID. There is no clinical evidence. I guess we're jumping a bit ahead there. You can go back a slide, Brendan. Thanks. There is no clinical evidence at this time regarding the effectiveness of portable air cleaners in reducing the risk of infectious disease. However, the benefits similar to HVAC systems can be applied provided that the same level of care and maintenance is conducted and the level of filtration is sufficient. Now, these could be a way to decouple ventilation and conditioning. So if your building is cooled by local air conditioning units rather than a central system, then this is a method that can be used to filter out contaminants that your air conditioning unit would not be capable of dealing with, since these units typically don't have filters. The unit ventilators or portable cleaners can also be beneficial around high-risk activities, such as COVID incident cleaning, or used in isolated areas. I do want to caution people regarding scams, though, and the effectiveness of these. To give a false sense of security they may provide. We're missing the photo here, but it was one ad campaign done by Indiegogo that was through an email blast that was titled "Fight Coronavirus with Cutting Edge Technology," and saying that this technology is being used in hospitals in Wuhan, which is basically not true. Ozone generators. These are devices that use the reactivity of ozone for the purpose of cleaning the air. These filtration devices work on the principle of altering the chemistry of other substances to remove odors and clean the air. These should not be used in occupied spaces because of the negative health effects that arise from exposure to ozone and its reaction products. High levels of ozone can be used to clean the air. However, these high levels are dangerous to the health of occupants. These levels of ozone used for cleaning have been associated with respiratory health related issues. The main point for discussion here is that these devices have not been shown to be effective in removing airborne contaminants, such as bacteria or virally infected droplets like COVID. A properly designed and maintained UV system, often in concert with filtration, humidity control, and airflow management, has been shown to reduce infections from viruses and can deactivate the COVID virus. These systems can have a high kill ratio, and the technology removes bacteria and viral contamination from the air. It's also effective in removing fungal growth in HVAC systems. The effectiveness of the UV systems has been shown in studies, as noted in my last point on the slide there. High-end systems provide benefits in high-density environments, such as flu clinics or public transportation, as large amounts of airflow can be achieved. But there are some drawbacks, as you'll need to consider the finishes, that they support UV and UV exposure, retrofitting existing systems, and properly designed systems are expensive. Cheap systems are just not worth it. Desk fans, ceiling fans, portable air conditioner units. So these need to be used cautiously. None of these systems have filtration. Essentially, they generate drafts. And it's these drafts that we discussed earlier that can be problematic. When they are used in building environments with reduced airflow, they can support disease spread. Education in the use of these to occupants is valuable here in minimizing the possibility of drafts. But if it's absolutely necessary to use these, carefully locate them that the airstream or draft is far away from occupants. This concludes my portion of the presentation. So I want to thank you, and I'm going to return the stage back to our host.
Thank you, Trevor and team. That was great. So we've got about 15 minutes left until we hit the top of the hour. So Brennan, I'm going to take control back here. And I'd like to open up the Q&A now. We just, apologies. So I've got a couple questions to start, and I apologize if you hear my cat meowing in the background, who apparently needs his lunch. So let's start off here. How do you support communications in perceived versus real risk? And I want to have a lot of sensitivity around that, because I hear what my clients are saying, I hear what my colleagues are saying, and the industry is saying about, you know, what's the latest in the news or the latest development, and we're learning so much as the situation unfolds and as research presents itself as available. So what are your thoughts on that? Like, how do you support communications in that regard and managing that with your clients?
So maybe I'm unmuted. Yeah, so maybe I'll take that. So I think there's sort of two sides to that. One, like at Pynchon, we're working to rely very closely on the advice that public health is providing. I mean, it's not necessarily possible for each of us as individuals, and even as Pynchon, who's looking at this information all the time, to stay on top of every new scientific development. So we have to look to organizations like the local public health department, Ontario Public Health Canada, the World Health Organization. These expert bodies are constantly running through information. Certainly they're hearing criticisms from time to time, and we all have heard about the comments about airborne transmission and the letter that was written by scientists. You know, but in the same way that we have to look at issues around global warming by looking at the consensus of the scientific body, I think we need to look at and support those public health organizations who are essentially providing us with that consensus opinion. And then, so I think from our side, if we're really consistent in that messaging, in talking about what public health is talking about and reinforcing that message, that's going to help. And then providing some objective measurements that, you know, support the fact the things that we're doing in the building are actually having the desired effect. So our ventilation is actually better. Our cleaning programs are working. You know, we haven't had a case in 20 days of operating the building and no cases of COVID so far. So those kind of ongoing communication pieces are going to be helpful in managing that perceived risk.
Mm-hmm. That's very helpful. And some of those risks just made me think, and like all that information about HVAC systems. I mean, what I'm hearing about just the most out there right now, like if there's a different, like every month there seems to be a different main point of focus, and the latest is HVAC systems, and are we upgrading the filters? Like what MERV do we have currently? Like how high can we go? And that seems to be the biggest focal point that I'm noticing right now. But what do you have any thoughts on what you are seeing right now on what you think is going to be the next hot topic?
So in conversations with clients just from today, you know, we have a number of clients who, you know, have put a plan together. They've made some changes to their building. Their tenants are starting to come back, and their tenants are asking, like, how do we know that this is actually going to work, right? So it's finding, you know, I think that it's going to be communicating and convincing the tenants that are coming back that the measures that we've taken are actually adequate to minimize the risk, right? So that seems to be the current hot topic above HVAC and all the other stuff that's out there. It's how do we really convince people that this is actually going to work and keep them safe in the building?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's all the things that we've kind of touched on today. Another question on the communications component, like, and the ease and the return back, and we're hearing more and more, like I'm hearing friends and family who are returning back to the workplace. You know, how much is too much for a company or facility manager to be sharing with the actual end user and staff coming back? I mean, you want to make sure that they're informed and they feel that you have conducted the right amount of due diligence, and they feel that comfort. But like how much is too much? Because you don't want to go down a rabbit hole either with someone who's maybe not a subject matter expert. So what are your, is there, or is it just a big gray area still, and we're still trying to figure it out?
So a lot of our clients, whether we've helped them with it or whether they've developed themselves, have put together kind of a client. They have an internal document that's their control program and how they're managing it. And they've also prepared a tenant-facing document as well that is essentially an executive summary of their management plan. That is the highlight pieces. And then I think, also communicate. They have a plan in place to communicate when problems happen. I think that's going to be very important as we reoccupy buildings. We're definitely going to have cases of COVID-19 in our building, and we don't want to be figuring out how we're going to tell people about that when it happens. Let's think about it hard now, not in the emergency. So, working those plans together. So I think you want to give them lots of information, and both the good and the bad, but you do want to keep it relatively high level, in that it's, these are the controls you're taking. These are how these controls work, and demonstrate that they are working.
Certainly. No, thank you for that. And just a reminder, everyone who's tuned in, you can use the chat function to ask questions on the fly as well. All right. What are some of the tools that can help facility managers, like when you're thinking about like on the ground, those of us in the community, what kind of tools can they use in socializing the importance of this risk mitigation? And it's not just with staff, but also the socializing the importance of it to the decision makers at their company. So say you're a service provider and you're there to support a company and you're trying to push that through. Are there any tools that you recommend that might be helpful in that regard? And
I'm
not just putting you on the spot. Trevor, Mark, you've been very quiet. I can't help but notice.
Well, one of the key things is communication, and not to be opaque about things. You never need to get into the technical details necessarily, although individuals are always free to request technical details, but that's not what you need to provide as an overall communication device. So we are, as members of the public, we are informed regularly about many of these standard tools for minimizing the risk, whether it's physical distancing, hand washing, wearing masks, gloves in certain conditions, etc. And enforcing that, and also not enforcing, but reinforcing the communication of that, and the also expressing where this information is coming from, the public health agencies, not only local but national and international, and stressing that your workplace's measures are in line with the measures that are being recommended by health authorities in general.
Yeah, I think it's really important to make sure that we're continuing to defer to the public agencies that have been providing updates throughout this entire crisis.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, another question. What are you hearing are the most concerning topics in reentry for property managers and end users alike? So obviously we've got the property managers who are more so managing like the common areas, and then end users who are managing their internal program areas. Obviously we've talked a lot about communication, but what are you hearing as the biggest concern from, or concerns plural, from some of the clients that you are working with today?
Trevor, do you want to take it, or do you want?
Share the wealth.
Well, I guess my response will probably be short. Any of the technical and facility managers that I would communicate with and deal with definitely have some grumblings associated with things, because it is a steep learning curve. It's difficult to implement all of these various changes into an already sometimes hectic daily routine that they have, and having a large responsibility of all these new policies and procedures on their shoulders definitely is trying on them for sure.
Indeed.
I mean, one of the things I've been hearing a fair bit is like, can you do air testing for like the SARS-CoV-2 virus responsible for COVID-19? And so, it seems that tenants in buildings are asking for that. And then landlords are coming to us and saying, hey, can you do that? And the answer simply is yes, we could do measurements for that, but I really don't think it's very helpful. There has to be someone, right now we have a very low caseload. We have to have someone infected. It has to be airborne in order for us to detect it in air samples. So we could probably go around in most buildings and spend an awful lot of clients' money taking air samples for the SARS-CoV-2 virus and tell them over and over again there's nothing there. And if the management program and controls aren't in place and working properly, the first time someone does come in with the symptoms, a number of people are going to get sick. So it's one of those things that people are asking for, but I don't know that it really helps the situation. You're much better to spend your time and money on developing the actual controls and monitoring and auditing those controls to make sure that they're happening than trying to sample for the SARS-CoV-2 virus.
Yeah, that's a good point. And also there's the thought, like is it helpful, but also you have to think about the companies who are also eager to get operations going again the next day, right? So if you have a confirmed case somewhere, if you are considered an essential service, the priority is also probably just trying to get the place cleaned overnight and then cleared for reoccupancy the next day. So it's a balancing act. It's there's a lot of things to consider. We do have a question from Debbie Beretta. Do you have any thoughts or comments to integrate an occupancy control management system? Any tech solutions that provides real-time occupancy loading within spaces and space desk utilization with air environment quality sensors?
Yeah, so not to be particularly pension specific about it, but we're working with a company called 11X out of Kitchener Waterloo who have a LoRa solution, and that so we can do continuous monitoring for carbon dioxide, for relative humidity, and for airborne particulate that are all sort of key control points around filtration and ventilation, and that LoRa sensor suite that's available includes things like desk occupancy sensors and those kind of things. So those kinds of things could be connected. And I know, we're in the process of moving offices, and the space planning company, our office has installed, occupancy sensors at all the desks in Pynchon about 6 months ago. So we got good data for 2 months, and then no one's been there for the last 4.
Perfect.
Certainly that stuff is possible and can be done. And I think it's those kind of solutions that can provide that kind of real feedback to the occupants to say, hey, the control measures are working, because you'll get a signal when CO2 levels are high, or your occupancy sensors say there's 50 desks in that call center that are all next to one another, they're all occupied. You can say, hey, we're not maintaining our physical distancing, and action can be taken and the situation corrected.
We are getting to the top of the hour, so I'd like to just pose one more question. There's a question here from Art of Vandermyden. I apologize if I did not pronounce that accurately. Can you Pynchon team, provide a bit more data or information on the transfer of droplets in systems? Seems like something easy to test and basic standards recommended. So you did have the one air conditioning study that was included here, but is there anything else you can comment on that?
You mean like specific data as far as numbers? But I mean,
data specifically is what this individual has asked. Yes.
Yeah, I don't have any specific data off the top of my head, other than some of the studies and some of the cases that have been reported, similar to the situation there in the Chinese restaurant. Other than it's still being looked at as far as ASHRAE is considered. It is a low risk, but there is the possibility of risk there, so they're not discounting it as something to be mindful of as far as your risk assessment and your reoccupancy goes.
Yeah,
I'm not sure if that really helps as far as.
And it's early days, right? Like what's available is what's available, and it may not feel like it, but we're still early into the pandemic compared to some countries, and as more countries are going through re-entry and hope, God willing, not having a second wave, information will come available as it does for sure. But I will close it there. Thank you again to the Pynchon team so much for today's presentation and active discussion. We need support like this from the FM community in order to continue programming during these unusual times. We will post today's recording to our YouTube channel. Thank you again for joining and being active. If you have any ideas on content for the future, please don't hesitate to reach out to us through our social media challenges. Lastly, IFMA Toronto and South Central Ontario would like to thank all of you that are working on the front line as essential workers. We could not get through this without you. Take care, stay healthy, and keep in touch. Bye.
Thank you.